We learned about the Federalist arguments for adopting the new Constitution. Remember, they published a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, right? They're not really creative with what they name these. And the purpose of these documents was to give the people of New York specifically a reason to ratify the Constitution as it was. Well, the Constitution created a strong central government, and that was troublesome for the Anti-Federalists. They were afraid that this could be a bad thing for the United States. So they published a series of arguments called the Anti-Federalist Papers. Again, really, really creative, right? Here's the purpose of the Anti-Federalist Papers. There's more to it, but we're going to go over three main purposes here. First, the Anti-Federalists were against creating a strong central government. If you ever are asked a question, what were the Anti-Federalists, what did they believe in, or what didn't they believe in, you could say they were against a strong central government. So if they were against a strong central government, well, they were in favor of states having the ability to govern themselves. So that's the second thing. Anti-Federalists believed that the states should govern themselves without influence from a central government. Now those two things go in, and there's some reasoning behind why they believe these things. The Anti-Federalists were afraid of creating a strong central government because the United States had just fought the Revolutionary War to escape oppression from a monarch who was too powerful. The King of England had too much power, and the colonists had just fought a war to get away from an oppressive, strong central government, or in this case, the king. You call him a tyrant even. And so they wanted the power to remain with the states, closer to the people. So who wrote the Anti-Federalist Papers? For the most part, they remained anonymous. We know who a lot of the authors were of the Federalist Papers, but for the Anti-Federalist Papers, they were pretty well disguised, I guess. I think some of the names, the pseudonyms they used were Brutus. I can't remember some of the other ones. But two guys that they believe created them were Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry. Now, these guys, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists, used the media to persuade people to buy into their ideas. And so, if you look here, the Anti-Federalists published their essays in various newspapers. And I gotta think, this is back in a time where there wasn't radio, television, any of that. The mass media, the way people communicated, the way news spread back then, was through the newspapers. This was the way you would spread your ideas. This is where you would market your product. This is where you would tell people things you believe. This is back in this day, their form of media, social media, whatever you're thinking of, that was the key way that they communicated and spread ideas. These newspapers proved to be very effective. The people read and understood why the Constitution could be dangerous when it came to protecting their individual rights. Let's read into what some of these essays said, okay? Anti-Federalist number 9. You could say the main idea here is that a consolidated government is tyranny. When we consolidate something, we push it all together, right? You group it all together. And he's saying when we do this, when we group this government all together, strong central government, we're creating tyranny, or a chance for tyranny. In Anti-Fed number 9, the author argues that all the important powers necessary to govern were given to the central government. So he's saying when we created this Constitution, we gave all the big powers, all the ones that are necessary to govern, we gave them to the central government. So the state is merely a place where we elect officials. That's the only purpose the state government holds. And they feel like that's leaving zero or little power to the states. We're just going to choose people to go to that federal government, which is a nice big deal, I guess. But for the most part, it's not giving them a lot of governing authority. And if you remember your shared powers, your state powers, and your federal powers, you'll see you can come up with a list of things that the states were supposed to do and that the federal government was supposed to do and some of the things that they shared. But this is back before a time when there weren't a lot of central education. There wasn't a lot of mandatory education going on and things like that. So the state's powers really did seem weak. Then Anti-Federalist number 17. There's a couple of main ideas in this one that are very important, and I like this one the most because I think this argument right here in Anti-Fed 17 is one of the key arguments that get to the core of why the Anti-Federalists were against a strong central government. They say Federalist power will ultimately subvert state authority. It means the Federalist power, the power that they give to the federal government, is going to ultimately undermine, ultimately get in the way, ultimately block state power, state authority. And they go over two pieces of this argument, two things in the Constitution that really scare them. We've kind of hit on them a couple of times, but I want to go over them again. That's how important they are. We have the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. Now, if I set this PowerPoint up right, I should click on one of these and it should take me to the slide related to it, but we'll see what happens. So let's look into Anti-Fed 17's argument about the Necessary and Proper Clause. They argue against the Necessary and Proper Clause. Anti-Federalists argue that this clause was a loophole that the government could use to expand its power. The Anti-Federalists said that this clause made all other limitations created earlier in the Constitution irrelevant. Okay? So they said, because we have the Necessary and Proper Clause, we're giving the federal government a way to get past any other restrictions, any other limitations we've made on them. Because all they have to do is say that this new law that the federal government creates, or that this new precedent is necessary and proper to govern. It's a loophole. The federal government can get around any limitations set on it by using this Necessary and Proper Clause to justify any law or any decision it makes. I'm going to jump to the Supremacy Clause, and they argue against the Supremacy Clause yet again. Okay? The Anti-Federalists continued to argue that this clause allowed the government a means to justify any of its laws it creates under the Necessary and Proper Clause. So it's almost like a cycle, this loophole. It allows them to create whatever law they think is necessary and proper, but then the federal government's law is also supreme. And so they're getting at the core. This is really scary. They can create and make whatever law they want, and it doesn't matter what the state says because the federal government's law is supreme. The Anti-Federalists in this essay warned the people that the government could pass any law they wanted. Then they could justify the law to the American people because under the Supremacy Clause, the federal government laws must be followed over any state law. All right? And later on, we're going to see this in a court case, McCullough versus Maryland, where the state Maryland tries to tax the federal bank, the U.S. bank. And this is one of the guys we watch a video on says it's the Who's Your Daddy clause. Can a state, or rather a child, tax the federal government, or rather a parent? Can the state demand money from the federal government? And we'll see which is supreme. So after all these things were published, we end up in this sort of common ground, or this medium, or this demand that the Anti-Federalists have. Now the Federalists are scared of it. The Federalists think that this is a bad idea. The Federalists think that by doing this Bill of Rights here, and I'll talk more about what exactly it is, that you're actually going to leave the government more power to take away other rights. So the Anti-Federalists wanted to make sure that there were certain rights that the federal government could not take away from them, no matter what. Okay? Certain rights that every single individual is guaranteed. Nope. All right. Hurry up, dude. Have a seat. They asked for these rights to be added to the Constitution. Okay? These 10 things, they wanted them added to the Constitution. These 10 rights were amended to the Constitution, and they are now the first 10 amendments, which we know as the Bill of Rights. Originally, there were a lot more of them, but they settled on 10 things. Okay? So again, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. And just a quick review of some of those things. We have the right to a speedy trial, the right to a trial by jury. We have the right to bear arms, guns, right? We have the right to freedom of speech, religion, petition, assemble. We have many other rights. And then the 10th one, which I think is really the core idea behind all the Bill of Rights. The 10th one is the Reserved Powers Clause. So it says, anything not listed in the Constitution, any right, anything not listed, any power not listed in the Constitution is left to the states, okay? And that will be very important to the future of our country, to how it adapts to things, but it also, we'll see how this Reserve Power Clause kind of shrinks and dwindles over time, and we end up with the federal government getting more rights, more power, more responsibility, and the state's government, in fact, shrinking and kind of falling back into the shadows when it comes to government in the United States.
The Bill of Rights is a listing of some rights, because not all of them are listed. The Ninth Amendment tells us that there are many which they haven't bothered to list for one reason or another. And it's a restriction with respect to particular rights. Particular restrictions are laid out. Congress shall make no law, right, establishing religion, so forth and so on. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? The due process rights in the Fifth Amendment against coerced testimony and so forth. So they're spelled out in some instances. Why are they there? Well, because at the time the Constitution was being ratified, there were essentially two schools of thought. There were people who were called the Federalists, came to be called the Federalists, who wanted some kind of centralized government. And there were the Anti-Federalists, who might have been willing to go along with some kind of centralized government, but were very suspicious of the kind of centralized government that was being proposed. And the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists essentially made a political deal. The Anti-Federalists said, all right, we'll go along with ratifying this Constitution if, within a reasonable length of time, a Bill of Rights is adopted so that we are secure in knowing that these particular rights that we consider to be most important will not come under the control of this new government that we're creating. Now, Alexander Hamilton, who was a centralist and a Federalist, made a good point in the Federalist number 84, if you go read that. He said, because he was opposed to a Bill of Rights, being a centralist, of course, he was opposed to a Bill of Rights. But what he says in that particular number of the Federalist makes a certain amount of sense. He says, look, as soon as you put in a Bill of Rights, you are implicitly admitting that this original document may have granted powers to override or contradict or take away those rights.
Say that again?
As soon as you have put in this Bill of Rights, you are admitting that the original Constitution may have had powers in it that were sufficient to override these rights. As soon as you put in a Bill of Rights that says Congress shall make no law establishing religion, you're implicitly suggesting that maybe Congress did have a power originally to establish a religion. Otherwise, why would you need this thing, right? So this is dangerous because it makes suggestions which people who are trying to gain power will use. They'll say, aha! And they'll also say, you've left some out. If you have a list of 20, what about this 21st one? Well, it isn't there, so I guess we're entitled to override that right. All right? And you see, that's precisely what has happened. Alexander Hamilton, in that particular, has been proven correct in the sense that what we see today in the judiciary, at least, is an idea that, well, essentially Congress has whatever powers it wants to have unless something in the Bill of Rights precludes it. As opposed to the concept of the Ninth Amendment and the 10th Amendment, which says, wait a minute, they have only the powers that are delegated to them, and everything else is over here, left with the states and the people. It's not just this list of the first 8 amendments, but the 9th and the 10th tell us there's a whole body of other things. So Hamilton, as a practical matter, has been proven right. He understood the logic of power seekers, that that's what they do. And he makes a good point. He says, you know, the Constitution, if it's read correctly, is a Bill of Rights itself because of the limitations it puts on Congress. And I give you just one example. Let's take the Second Amendment, and let's take the powers of Congress over the militia. Because Congress has certain powers with respect to the militia which were put there so we could have uniformity. And one of them is the power of Congress to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. Let's just take the one arming. Power to provide for arming the militia. Well, if we look back historically at what that power entailed, what that meant, it was that everyone was supposed to have a gun. So if Congress was arming the militia according to the constitutional pattern pre-Second Amendment, Congress had the authority and the duty to make sure that every American from 15 to 50 or 60 or whatever that age group was had a gun. And what kind of a gun? A military-grade firearm, all right? Now, I would think that that's a pretty good right established right there in the Constitution. In a sense, it goes further even than the Second Amendment does, right? Because it's an injunction against Congress to directly do this, provide for this, right? And if we look at what goes on in gun control today, what do we see? Well, the only kind of judicial intervention is through the Second Amendment. They don't even go back and point out that it's Congress's responsibility not to pass laws disarming people, but to pass laws providing them with firearms. So if you just look at that one, Hamilton was exactly correct. If we really looked at this Constitution and what Congress was required to do in that particular, we wouldn't even need a Second Amendment.